could not help noticing a certain peculiarity of expression, as it were, a restrained radiance about the face and whole figure of Stepan Arkadyevitch. Oblonsky took off his overcoat, and with his hat over one ear walked into the dining-room, giving directions to the Tatar waiters who were clustered about him in evening coats bearing napkins, bowing right and left to the people he met, and here as everywhere joyously greeting acquaintances. He went up to the sideboard for a preliminary appetizer of fish and vodka, and said to the painted Frenchwoman decked in ribbons, lace, and ringlets behind the counter something so amusing that even that Frenchwoman was moved to genuine laughter. Levin, for his part, refrained from taking any vodka simply because he felt such a loathing of that Frenchwoman, all made up, it seemed, of false hair, poudre de riz, and vinaigre de toilette. He made haste to move away from her, as from a dirty place. His whole soul was filled with memories of Kitty, and there was a smile of triumph and happiness shining in his eyes. "This way, your Excellency, please. Your Excellency won't be disturbed here," said a particularly pertinacious, white-headed old Tatar with immense hips and coat-tails gaping widely behind. "Walk in, your Excellency," he said to Levin, by way of showing his respect to Stepan Arkadyevitch, being attentive to his guest as well. Instantly flinging a fresh cloth over the round table under the bronze chandelier, though it already had a tablecloth on it, he pushed up velvet chairs, and came to a standstill before Stepan Arkadyevitch with a napkin and a bill of fare in his hands, awaiting his commands. "If you prefer, your Excellency, a private room will be free directly. Prince Golistin with a lady. Fresh oysters have come in." "Ah, oysters!" Stepan Arkadyevitch became thoughtful. "How if we were to change our program, Levin?" he said, keeping his finger on the bill of fare, and his face expressed serious hesitation. "Are the oysters good? Mind now." "They're Flensburg, your Excellency. We've no Ostend." "Flensburg will do, but are they fresh?" "Only arrived yesterday." "Well then, how if we were to begin with oysters, and so change the whole program, eh?" "It's all the same to me. I should like cabbage soup and porridge better than anything, but of course there's nothing like that here." "Porridge à la Russe, your honor would like?" said the Tatar, bending down to Levin like a nurse speaking to a child. "No, joking apart, whatever you choose is sure to be good. I've been skating and I'm hungry. And don't imagine," he added, detecting a look of dissatisfaction on Oblonsky's face, "that I shan't appreciate your choice. I'm fond of good things." "I should hope so. After all, it's one of the pleasures of life," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Well then, my friend, you give us 2, or better say 3 dozen oysters, clear soup with vegetables." "Printanieri," prompted the Tatar, but Stepan Arkadyevitch apparently did not care to allow him the satisfaction of giving the French names of the dishes. "With vegetables in it, you know. Then turbot with thick sauce, then roast beef, and mind it's good. Yes, and capons perhaps, and then sweets." The Tatar, recollecting that it was Stepan Arkadyevitch's way not to call the dishes by the names in the French bill of fare, did not repeat them after him, but could not resist rehearsing the whole menu to himself according to the bill. "Soupe printanière, turbot, sauce bermarchés, poulard à l'estragon, macédoine de fruits," etc. And then instantly, as though worked by springs, laying down one bound bill of fare, he took up another, the list of wines, and submitted it to Stepan Arkadyevitch. "What shall we drink?" "What you like, only not too much. Champagne?" said Levin. "What, to start with?" "You're right, though, I dare say. Do you like the white seal?" "Cachet blanc?" prompted the Tatar. "Very well, then. Give us that brand with the oysters, and then we'll see." "Yes, sir. And what table wine?" "You can give us Nuit." "Oh, no, better the classic Chablis." "Yes, sir. And your cheese, your Excellency?" "Oh, yes, Parmesan. Or would you like another?" "No, it's all the same to me," said Levin, unable to suppress a smile. And the Tatar ran off with flying coat-tails, and in 5 minutes darted in with a dish of opened oysters on mother-of-pearl shells, and a bottle between his fingers. Stepan Arkadyevitch crushed the starchy napkin, tucked it into his waistcoat, and settling his arms comfortably, started on the oysters. "Not bad," he said, stripping the oysters from the pearly shell with a silver fork and swallowing them one after another. "Not bad," he repeated, turning his dewy, brilliant eyes from Levin to the Tatar. Levin ate the oysters indeed, though white bread and cheese would have pleased him better, but he was admiring Oblonsky. Even the Tatar, uncorking the bottle and pouring the sparkling wine into the delicate glasses, glanced at Stepan Arkadyevitch, and settled his white cravat with a perceptible smile of satisfaction. You don't care much for oysters, do you?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, emptying his wine-glass. "Or you're worried about something, eh?" He wanted Levin to be in good spirits, but it was not that Levin was not in good spirits. He was ill at ease. With what he had in his soul, he felt sore and uncomfortable in the restaurant, in the midst of private rooms where men were dining with ladies, in all this fuss and bustle. The surroundings of bronzes, looking-glasses, gas and waiters, all of it was offensive to him. He was afraid of sullying what his soul was brimful of. "I? Yes, I am, but besides, all this bothers me," he said. "You can't conceive how queer it all seems to a country person like me, as queer as that gentleman's nails I saw at your place." "Yes, I saw how much interested you were in poor Grinevitch's nails," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, laughing. "It's too much for me," responded Levin. "Do try now and put yourself in my place. Take the point of view of a country person. We in the country try to bring our hands into such a state as will be most convenient for working with. So we cut our nails. Sometimes we turn up our sleeves. And here people purposely let their nails grow as long as they will, and link on small saucers by way of studs so that they can do nothing with their hands." Stepan Arkadyevitch smiled gaily. "Oh yes, that's just a sign that he has no need to do coarse work. His work is with the mind." "Maybe, but it's still queer to me, just as at this moment it seems queer to me that we country folks try to get our meals over as soon as we can, so as to be ready for our work, while here are we trying to drag out our meal as long as possible, and with that object eating oysters." "Why, of course," objected Stepan Arkadyevitch, "but that's just the aim of civilization, to make everything a source of enjoyment." "Well, if that's its aim, I'd rather be a savage." "And so you are a savage. All you Levins are savages." Levin sighed. He remembered his brother Nikolai and felt ashamed and sore, and he scowled. But Oblonsky began speaking of a subject which at once drew his attention. "Oh, I say, are you going tonight to our people, the Shtcherbatskys, I mean?" he said, his eyes sparkling significantly as he pushed away the empty rough shells and drew the cheese toward him. "Yes, certainly I shall go," replied Levin, though I fancied the princess was not very warm in her invitation. "What nonsense, that's her manner. Come, boy, the soup!" "That's her manner, grande dame," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "I'm coming too, but I have to go to the Countess Bonina's rehearsal. Come, isn't it true that you're a savage? How do you explain the sudden way in which you vanished from Moscow? The Shtcherbatskys were continually asking about you, as though I ought to know. The only thing I know is that you always do what no one else does." "Yes," said Levin, slowly and with emotion. "You're right. I am a savage. Only my savageness is not in having gone away, but in coming now. Now I've come." "Oh, what a lucky fellow you are!" broke in Stepan Arkadyevitch, looking into Levin's eyes. "Why?" "I know a gallant steed by tokens sure, and by his eyes I know a youth in love," declaimed Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Everything is before you." "Why, is it over for you already?" "No, not over exactly, but the future is yours, and the present is mine, and the present, well, it's not all that it might be." "How so?" "Oh, things go wrong, but I don't want to talk of myself, and besides, I can't explain it all," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Well, why have you come to Moscow then?" "Hi, take away!" he called to the Tatar. "You guessed?" responded Levin, his eyes like deep wells of light fixed on Stepan Arkadyevitch. "I guess, but I can't be the first to talk about it. You can see by that whether I guess right or wrong," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, gazing at Levin with a subtle smile. "Well, and what have you to say to me?" said Levin in a quivering voice, feeling that all the muscles of his face were quivering too. "How do you look at the question?" Stepan Arkadyevitch slowly emptied his glass of Chablis, never taking his eyes off Levin. "I?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "There's nothing I desire so much as that. Nothing. It would be the best thing that could be." "But you're not making a mistake. You know what we're speaking of," said Levin, piercing him with his eyes. "You think it's possible?" "I think it's possible. Why not possible?" "No, do you really think it's possible? Tell me all you think. Oh, but if refusal's in store for me, indeed I feel sure." "Why should you think that?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, smiling at his excitement. "It seems so to me sometimes. That will be awful for me, and for her too. Oh, well, anyway, there's nothing awful in it for a girl. Every girl's proud of an offer." "Yes, every girl, but not she." Stepan Arkadyevitch smiled. He knew so well that feeling of Levin's, that for him all the girls were divided into two classes. One class, all the girls in the world except her, and those girls with all sorts of human weaknesses, and very ordinary girls. The other class, she alone, having no weaknesses of any sort, and higher than all humanity. "Stay, take some sauce," he said, holding back Levin's hand as it pushed away the sauce. Levin obediently helped himself to sauce, but would not let Stepan Arkadyevitch go on with his dinner. "No, stop a minute," he said. "You must understand, it's a question of life and death for me. I've never spoken to anyone of this. There's no one I could speak it to except you. You know, we're utterly unlike each other, different tastes and views and everything, but I know you're fond of me, and you understand me, and that's why I like you awfully. But for God's sake, be quite straightforward with me." "I'll tell you what I think," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, smiling. "But I'll say more. My wife is a wonderful woman." Stepan Arkadyevitch sighed, remembering his position with his wife, and after a moment's silence resumed, "She has a gift of foreseeing things. She sees right through people, but that's not all. She knows what will come to pass, especially in the way of marriages. She foretold, for instance, that Princess Shahovskaya would marry Brenteln. No one would believe it, but it came to pass, and she's on your side." "How do you mean?" "It's not only that she likes you. She says that Kitty is certain to be your wife." At these words Levin's face suddenly lighted up with a smile not far from tears of emotion. "She says that?" cried Levin. "I always said she was exquisite, your wife. There, that's enough. Enough said about it," he said, getting up from his seat. "All right, but do sit down." But Levin could not sit down. He walked with his firm tread twice up and down the little cage of a room, blinked his eyelids that his tears might not fall, and only then sat down to the table. "You must understand," said he, "it's not love. I've been in love, but it's not that. It's not my feeling, but a sort of force outside me has taken possession of me. I went away, you see, because I made up my mind that it never could be, you understand, as a happiness that does not come on earth. But I've struggled with myself, I see there's no living without it, and it must be settled." "What did you go away for?" Stop a minute. The thoughts that come crowding in on one, the questions one must ask oneself. Listen, you can't imagine what you've done for me by what you've said. I'm so happy that I've become positively hateful. I've forgotten everything. I heard today that my brother Nikolai, you know, he's here. I had even forgotten him. It seems to me that he's happy too. It's a sort of madness. But one thing's awful. Here, you've been married, you know the feeling. It's awful that we, old, with a past, not of love but of sins, are brought all at once so near to a creature so pure and innocent. It's loathsome, and that's why one can't help feeling oneself unworthy." "Oh, well, you've not many sins on your conscience." "Alas, all the same," said Levin, "when with loathing over my life I shudder and curse and bitterly regret it." "Yes, what would you have? The world is made so," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "The only comfort is like that prayer which I always liked. Forgive me not according to my unworthiness, but according to thy loving kindness. That's the only way she can forgive me." End of chapter 10. This recording is in the public domain. Anna Karenina, Part 1, Chapter 2, read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. Stepan Arkadyevitch was a truthful man in his relations with himself. He was incapable of deceiving himself and persuading himself that he repented of his conduct. He could not at this date repent of the fact that he, a handsome, susceptible man of 34, was not in love with his wife, the mother of 5 living and 2 dead children, and only a year younger than himself. All he repented of was that he had not succeeded in hiding it better from his wife. But he felt all the difficulty of his position, and was sorry for his wife, his children, and himself. Possibly he might have managed to conceal his sins better from his wife if he had anticipated that the knowledge of them would have had such an effect on her. He had never clearly thought out the subject, but he had vaguely conceived that his wife must long ago have suspected him of being unfaithful to her and shut her eyes to the fact. He had even supposed that she, a worn-out woman, no longer young or good-looking, and in no way remarkable or interesting, merely a good mother, ought from a sense of fairness to take an indulgent view. It had turned out quite the other way. "Oh, it's awful! Oh, dear, awful!" Stepan Arkadyevitch kept repeating to himself, and he could think of nothing to be done. And how well things were going up until now! How well we got on! She was contented and happy in her children. I never interfered with her in anything. I let her manage the children and the house just as she liked. It's true it's bad, her having been a governess in our house. That's bad. There's something common, vulgar in flirting with one's governess, but what a governess! He vividly recalled the roguish black eyes of Mademoiselle Roland and her smile. But after all, while she was in the house, I kept myself in hand, and the worst of it all is that she's already... It seems as if ill luck would have had it so. Oh, but what is to be done? There was no solution, but that universal solution which life gives to all questions, even the most complex and insoluble. The answer is, one must live in the needs of the day, that is, forget oneself. To forget himself in sleep was impossible now, at least till night-time. He could not go back now to the music sung by the decanter women, so he must forget himself in the dream of daily life. "Then we shall see," said Stepan Arkadyevitch to himself. And, getting up, he put on a grey dressing-gown lined with blue silk, tied the tassels in a knot, and drawing a deep breath of air into his broad, bare chest, he walked to the window with his usual confident step, turning out his feet that carried his full frame so easily. He pulled up the blind and rang the bell loudly. It was at once answered by the appearance of an old friend, his valet, Matvey, carrying his clothes, boots, and a telegram. Matvey was followed by the barber with all the necessities for shaving. "Are there any papers from the office?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, taking the telegram and seating himself at the looking-glass. "On the table," replied Matvey, glancing with inquiring sympathy at his master, and after a short pause he added with a sly smile, "They've sent from the carriage jobbers." Stepan Arkadyevitch made no reply. He merely glanced at Matvey in the looking-glass. In the glance, in which their eyes met in the looking-glass, it was clear that they understood one another. Stepan Arkadyevitch's eyes asked, "Why do you tell me that? Don't you know?" Matvey put his hands in his jacket pockets, thrust out one leg, and gazed silently, good-humouredly, with a faint smile, at his master. "I told them to come on Sunday, and till then not to trouble you or themselves for nothing," he said. He had obviously prepared the sentence beforehand. Stepan Arkadyevitch saw Matvey wanted to make a joke and attract attention to himself. Tearing open the telegram, he read it through, guessing at the words, misspelt as they always are in telegrams, and his face brightened. "Matvey, my sister Anna Arkadyevna will be here tomorrow," he said, checking for a minute the sleek, plump hand of the barber, cutting a pink path through his long, curly whiskers. "Thank God," said Matvey, showing by this response that he, like his master, realized the significance of this arrival. That is, that Anna Arkadyevna, the sister he was so fond of, might bring about a reconciliation between husband and wife. "Alone or with her husband?" inquired Matvey. Stepan Arkadyevitch could not answer, as the barber was at work on his upper lip, and he raised one finger. Matvey nodded at the looking-glass. "Alone. Is the room to be got ready upstairs?" "Inform Darya Alexandrovna, where she orders." "Darya Alexandrovna?" Matvey repeated, as though in doubt. "Yes, inform her. Here, take the telegram, give it to her, and then do what she tells you." "You want to try it on," Matvey understood, but he only said, "Yes, sir." Stepan Arkadyevitch was already washed and combed and ready to be dressed when Matvey, stepping deliberately in his creaky boots, came back into the room with his telegram in his hand. The barber had gone. "Darya Alexandrovna told me to inform you that she's going away. Let him do, that is, you, as he likes," he said, laughing only with his eyes and putting his hands in his pockets. He watched his master with his head on one side. Stepan Arkadyevitch was silent a moment. Then a good-humoured and rather pitiful smile showed itself on his handsome face. "Eh, Matvey?" he said, shaking his head. "It's all right, sir. She will come round," said Matvey. "Come round?" "Yes, sir." "Do you think so? Who's there?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, hearing the rustle of a woman's dress at the door. "It's I," said a firm, pleasant woman's voice, and the stern, pock-marked face of Matrona Philimonovna, the nurse, was thrust in at the door. "Well, what is it, Matrona?" queried Stepan Arkadyevitch, getting up to her at the door. Although Stepan Arkadyevitch was completely in the wrong as regards his wife, and was conscious of this himself, almost everyone in the house, even the nurse, Darya Alexandrovna's chief ally, was on his side. "Well, what now?" he asked disconsolately. "Go to her, sir. Own your fault again. Maybe God will aid you. She is suffering so, it's sad to see her. And besides, everything in this house is topsy-turvy. You must have pity, sir, on the children. Beg her forgiveness, sir. There's no help for it. One must take the consequences." "But she won't see me." "You do your part. God is merciful. Pray to God, sir. Pray to God." "Come, that'll do. You can go," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, blushing suddenly. "Well, now, do dress me." He turned to Matvey and threw off his dressing-gown decisively. Matvey was already holding up the shirt like a horse's collar, and blowing off some invisible speck, He slipped it with obvious pleasure over the well-groomed body of his master. End of Part 1, Chapter 2. Anna Karenina, Book 1, Chapter 3, read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. When he was dressed, Stepan Arkadyevitch sprinkled some scent on himself, pulled down his shirt cuffs, distributed into his pockets his cigarettes, pocketbook, matches, and watch with its double chain and seals, and shaking out his handkerchief, feeling himself clean, fragrant, healthy, and physically at ease, in spite of his unhappiness, he walked with a slight swing on each leg into the dining-room, where coffee was already waiting for him, and beside the coffee, letters and papers from the office. He read the letters. One was very unpleasant, from a merchant who was buying a forest on his wife's property. To sell this forest was absolutely essential, but at present, until he was reconciled with his wife, the subject could not be discussed. The most unpleasant thing of all was that his pecuniary interest should in this way enter into the question of his reconciliation with his wife, and the idea that he might be led on by his interests, that he might seek a reconciliation with his wife on account of the sale of the forest, that idea hurt him. When he had finished his letters, Stepan Arkadyevitch moved the office papers close to him, rapidly looked through 2 pieces of business, made a few notes with a big pencil, and pushing away the papers, turned to his coffee. As he sipped his coffee, he opened a still damp morning paper and began reading it. Stepan Arkadyevitch took in and read a liberal paper, not an extreme one, but one advocating the views held by the majority, and in spite of the fact that science, art, and politics had no special interest for him, he firmly held those views on all these subjects which were held by the majority and by his paper, and he only changed them when the majority changed them, or more strictly speaking, he did not change them, but they imperceptibly changed of themselves within him. Stepan Arkadyevitch had not chosen his political opinions or his views. These political opinions and views had come to him of themselves, just as he did not choose the shapes of his hat and coat, but simply took those that were being worn. And for him, living in a certain society, owing to the need, ordinarily developed at years of discretion, for some degree of mental activity, to have views was just as indispensable as to have a hat. If there was a reason for his preferring liberal to conservative views, which were held also by many of his circle, it arose not from his considering liberalism more rational, but from it being in closer accordance with his manner of life. The Liberal party said that in Russia everything is wrong, and certainly Stepan Arkadyevitch had many debts and was decidedly short of money. The Liberal party said that marriage is an institution quite out of date, and that it needs reconstruction. And family life certainly afforded Stepan Arkadyevitch little gratification, and forced him into lying and hypocrisy, which was so repulsive to his nature. The Liberal party said, or rather allowed it to be understood, that religion is only a curb to keep in check the barbarous classes of the people, and Stepan Arkadyevitch could not get through even a short service without his legs aching from standing up, and could never make out what was the object of all the terrible and high-flown language about another world, when life might be so very amusing in this world. And with all this, Stepan Arkadyevitch, who liked to joke, was fond of puzzling a plain man by saying that if he prided himself on his origin, he ought not to stop at Rurik and disown the first founder of his family, the monkey. And so liberalism had become a habit of Stepan Arkadyevitch, and he liked his newspaper, as he did his cigar after dinner, for the slight fog it diffused in his brain. He read the leading article, in which it was maintained that it was quite senseless in our day to raise an outcry that radicalism was threatening to swallow up all the conservative elements, and that government ought to take measures to crush the revolutionary hydra. That on the contrary, quote, "In our opinion, the danger lies not in that fantastic revolutionary hydra, but in the obstinacy of traditionalism clogging progress," etc., etc. He read another article, too, a financial one, which alluded to Bentham and Mill, and dropped some innuendos reflecting on the ministry. With his characteristic quick-wittedness, he caught the drift of each innuendo, divined whence it came, at whom and on what ground it was aimed, and that afforded him, as it always did, a certain satisfaction. But today that satisfaction was embittered by Matrona Philimonovna's advice, and the unsatisfactory state of the household. He read, too, that Count Beist was rumoured to have left for Wiesbaden, and that one need have no more grey hair, and of the sale of a light carriage, and of a young person seeking a situation. But these items of information did not give him, as usual, a quiet, ironical gratification. Having finished the paper, a second cup of coffee, and a roll and butter, he got up, shaking the crumbs of the roll off his waistcoat, and squaring his broad chest, he smiled joyously, not because there was anything particularly agreeable in his mind. The joyous smile was evoked by a good digestion. But this joyous smile at once recalled everything to him, and he grew thoughtful. Two childish voices, Stepan Arkadyevitch recognized the voices of Grisha, his youngest boy, and Tanya, his eldest girl, were heard outside the door. They were carrying something, and dropped it. "I told you not to sit passengers on the roof," said the little girl in English. "There, pick them up." "Everything's in confusion," thought Stepan Arkadyevitch. "There are the children running about by themselves." And going to the door, he called them. They threw down the box, that represented a train, and came in to their father. The little girl, her father's favourite, ran up boldly, embraced him, and hung laughingly on his neck, enjoying, as she always did, the smell of scent that came from his whiskers. At last the little girl kissed his face, which was flushed from his stooping posture, and beaming with tenderness, loosed her hands, and was about to run away again, but her father held her back. "How's mamma?" he asked, passing his hand over his daughter's smooth, soft little neck. "Good morning," he said, smiling to the boy who had come up to greet him. He was conscious that he loved the boy less, and always tried to be fair, but the boy felt it, and did not respond with a smile to his father's chilly smile. "Mamma, she's up," answered the girl. Stepan Arkadyevitch sighed. "That means she's not slept again all night," he thought. "Well, is she cheerful?" The little girl knew that there was a quarrel between her father and mother, and that her mother could not be cheerful, and that her father must be aware of this, and that he was pretending when he asked about it so lightly, and she blushed for her father. He at once perceived it, and blushed too. "I don't know," she said. "She did not say we must do our lessons, but she said we were to go for a walk with Miss Hoole to grandmamma's." "Well, go, Tanya, my darling. Oh, wait a minute, though," he said, still holding her and stroking her soft little hand. He took off the mantelpiece, where he had put it yesterday, a little box of sweets, and gave her two, picking out her favourites, a chocolate and a fondant. "For Grisha?" said the little girl, pointing to the chocolate. "Yes, yes." And still stroking her little shoulder, he kissed her on the roots of her hair and neck, and let her go. "The carriage is ready," said Matvey, "but there's someone to see you with a petition." "Been here long?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Half an hour." "How many times have I told you to tell me at once?" "One must let you drink your coffee in peace, at least," said Matvey, in the affectionately gruff tone with which it was impossible to be angry. "Well, show the person up at once," said Oblonsky, frowning with vexation. The petitioner, the widow of a staff captain, Karenina, came with a request impossible and unreasonable. But Stepan Arkadyevitch, as he generally did, made her sit down, heard her to the end attentively without interrupting her, and gave her detailed advice as to how and to whom to apply, and even wrote her in his large, sprawling, good and legible hand a confident and fluent little note to a personage who might be of use to her. Having got rid of the staff captain's widow, Stepan Arkadyevitch took his hat and stopped to recollect whether he had forgotten anything. It appeared that he had forgotten nothing except what he wanted to forget: his wife. "Ah, yes." He bowed his head, and his handsome face assumed a harassed expression. "To go or not to go," he said to himself, and an inner voice told him that he must not go, that nothing could come of it but falsity, that to amend, to set right their relations, was impossible, because it was impossible to make her attractive again and able to inspire love, or to make him an old man not susceptible to love. Except deceit and lying, nothing could come of it now, and deceit and lying were opposed to his nature. "It must be some time, though. It can't go on like this," he said, trying to give himself courage. He squared his chest, took out a cigarette, took 2 whiffs at it, flung it into a mother-of-pearl ashtray, and with rapid steps walked through the drawing-room and opened the other door into his wife's bedroom. End of chapter 3. Part 1, Chapter 4 of Anna Karenina, read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. Darya Alexandrovna, in a dressing jacket, and with her now scanty, once luxuriant and beautiful hair fastened up with hairpins on the nape of her neck, with a sunken, thin face, and large, startled eyes, which looked prominent from the thinness of her face, was standing among a litter of all sorts of things scattered all over the room, before an opened bureau, from which she was taking something. Hearing her husband's steps, she stopped, looking toward the door, and trying assiduously to give her features a severe and contemptuous expression. She felt she was afraid of him, and afraid of the coming interview. She was just attempting to do what she had attempted to do 10 times already in the last 3 days, to sort out the children's things and her own, so as to take them to her mother's. And again, she could not bring herself to do this. But now, again, as each time before, she kept saying to herself that things cannot go on like this, that she must take some step to punish him, put him to shame, avenge on him some little part at least of the suffering he had caused her. She still continued to tell herself that she should leave him, but she was conscious that this was impossible. It was impossible because she could not get out of the habit of regarding him as her husband and loving him. Besides this, she realized that if even here in her own house she could hardly manage to look after her 5 children properly, they would be still worse off where she was going with them all. As it was, even in the course of these 3 days, the youngest was unwell from being given unwholesome soup, and the others had almost gone without their dinner the day before. She was conscious that it was impossible to go away, but, cheating herself, she went on all the same sorting out her things and pretending that she was going. Seeing her husband, she dropped her hands into the drawer of the bureau as though looking for something, and only looked round at him when he had come quite up to her. But her face, to which she tried to give a severe and resolute expression, betrayed bewilderment and suffering. "Dolly," he said, in a subdued and timid voice. He bent his head toward his shoulder and tried to look pitiful and humble, but for all that he was radiant with freshness and health. In a rapid glance she scanned his figure that beamed with health and freshness. Yes, he is happy and content, she thought, while and that disgusting good nature, which everyone likes him for and praises, I hate that good nature of his, she thought. Her mouth stiffened. The muscles of the cheek contracted on the right side of her pale, nervous face. "What do you want?" she said, in a rapid, deep, unnatural voice. "Dolly," he repeated, with a quiver in his voice. "Anna is coming today." "Well, what is that to me? I can't see her," she cried. "But you must, really, Dolly." "Go away!" she shrieked, not looking at him, as though this shriek were called up by physical pain. Stepan Arkadyevitch could be calm when he thought of his wife. He could hope that she would come round, as Matvey expressed it, and could quietly go on reading his paper and drinking his coffee. But when he saw her tortured, suffering face, heard the tone of her voice, submissive to fate and full of despair, there was a catch in his breath and a lump in his throat, and his eyes began to shine with tears. "My God, what have I done? Dolly, for God's sake, you know—" He could not go on. There was a sob in his throat. She shut the bureau with a slam and glanced at him. "Dolly, what can I say? One thing, forgive. Remember, cannot 9 years of my life atone for an instant?" She dropped her eyes and listened, expecting what he would say, as it were beseeching him in some way or other to make her believe differently. "Instant of passion," he said, and would have gone on, but at that word, as at a pang of physical pain, her lips stiffened again, and again the muscles of her right cheek worked. "Go away, go out of the room!" she shrieked, still more shrilly, "and don't talk to me of your passion and your loathsomeness!" She tried to go out, but tottered and clung to the back of a chair to support herself. His face relaxed, his lips swelled, his eyes were swimming with tears. "Dolly," he said, sobbing now, "for mercy's sake, think of the children. They're not to blame. I am to blame, and punish me, make me expiate my fault. Anything I can do, I am ready to do, anything. I am to blame, no words can express how much I am to blame. But, Dolly, forgive me." She sat down. He listened to her hard, heavy breathing, and he was unutterably sorry for her. She tried several times to begin to speak, but could not. He waited. "You remember the children, Stiva, to play with them. But I remember them and know that this means their ruin," she said, obviously one of the phrases she had more than once repeated to herself in the course of the last few days. She had called him Stiva, and he glanced at her with gratitude and moved to take her hand, but she drew back from him with aversion. "I think of the children. and for that reason I would do anything in the world to save them. But I don't myself know how to save them. By taking them away from their father, or by leaving them with a vicious father. Yes, a vicious father. Tell me, after what has happened, can we live together? Is that possible? Tell me, is it possible, she repeated, raising her voice, after my husband, the father of my children, enters into a love affair with his own children's governess? But what could I do? What could I do? He kept saying in a pitiful voice, not knowing what he was saying, as his head sank lower and lower. You are loathsome to me, repulsive, she shrieked, getting more and more heated. Your tears mean nothing. You've never loved me. You have neither heart nor honorable feeling. You are hateful to me, disgusting, a stranger, a complete stranger. With pain and wrath she uttered the word so terrible to herself, stranger. He looked at her, and the fury expressed in her face alarmed and amazed him. He did not understand how his pity for her exasperated her. She saw in him sympathy for her, but not love. No, she hates me. She will not forgive me, he thought. It is awful, awful, he said. At that moment, in the next room, a child began to cry. Probably it had fallen down. Darya Alexandrovna listened, and her face suddenly softened. She seemed to be pulling herself together for a few seconds, as though she did not know where she was and what she was doing, and getting up rapidly, she moved towards the door. Well, she loves my child, he thought, noticing the change of her face at the child's cry. My child? How can she hate me? Dolly, one word more, he said, following her. If you come near me, I will call in the servants, the children. They may all know you are a scoundrel. I am going away at once, and you may live here with your mistress. And she went out, slamming the door. Stepan Arkadyevitch sighed, wiped his face, and with a subdued tread walked out of the room. Matvey says she will come round, but how? I don't see the least chance of it. Oh, how horrible it is, and how vulgarly she shouted, he said to himself, remembering her shriek and the words scoundrel and mistress. And very likely the maids were listening. Horribly vulgar, horrible. Stepan Arkadyevitch stood a few seconds alone, wiped his face, squared his chest, and walked out of the room. It was Friday, and in the dining room the German watchmaker was winding up the clock. Stepan Arkadyevitch remembered his joke about this punctual bald watchmaker, that the German was wound up for a whole lifetime himself to wind up watches, and he smiled. Stepan Arkadyevitch was fond of a joke. And maybe she will come round. That's a good expression, come round, he thought. I must repeat that. Matvey, he shouted. Arrange everything with Darya in the sitting-room for Anna Arkadyevna, he said to Matvey when he came in. Yes, sir. Stepan Arkadyevitch put on his fur coat and went out onto the steps. You won't dine at home? Said Matvey, seeing him off. That's as it happens. But here's for the housekeeping, he said, taking 10 roubles from his pocket-book. That'll be enough. Enough or not enough, we must make it do, said Matvey, slamming the carriage door and stepping back onto the steps. Darya Alexandrovna, meanwhile, having pacified the child, and knowing from the sound of the carriage that he had gone off, went back again to her bedroom. It was her solitary refuge from the household cares which crowded upon her directly she went out of it. Even now, in the short time she had been in the nursery, the English governess and Matrona Philimonovna had succeeded in putting several questions to her, which did not admit of delay, and which only she could answer. What were the children to put on for their walk? Should they have any milk? Should not a new cook be sent for? Oh, let me alone, she said, and going back to her bedroom, she sat down in the same place as she had sat when talking to her husband, clasping tightly her thin hands with the rings that slipped down on her bony fingers, and fell to going over in her memory all the conversation. He is gone, but has he broken it off with her, she thought. Can it be he sees her? Why didn't I ask him? No, reconciliation is impossible. Even if we remain in the same house, we are strangers, strangers forever. She repeated again with special significance the words so dreadful to her. And how I loved him! My God, how I loved him! How I loved him! And now don't I love him? Don't I love him more than before? The most horrible thing is, she began, but did not finish her thought, because Matrona Philimonovna put in her head at the door. Let us send for my brother, she said. He can get a dinner anyway, or we shall have the children getting nothing to eat till 6 again, like yesterday. Very well, I will come directly and see about it. But did you send for some new milk? and Darya Alexandrovna plunged into the duties of the day, and drowned her grief in them for a time. End of Part 1, Chapter 4. Part 1, Chapter 5 of Anna Karenina. Read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. Stepan Arkadyevitch had learned easily at school, thanks to his excellent abilities, but he had been idle and mischievous, and therefore was one of the lowest in his class. But in spite of his habitually dissipated mode of life, his inferior grade in the service, and his comparative youth, he occupied the honorable and lucrative position of president of one of the government boards at Moscow. This position he had received through his sister Anna's husband, Alexey Alexandrovitch Karenin, who held one of the most important positions in the ministry to whose department the Moscow office belonged. But if Karenin had not got his brother-in-law this berth, then through 100 other personages, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles and aunts, Stiva Oblonsky would have received this post, or some other similar one, together with the salary of 6,000, absolutely needful for him, as his affairs, in spite of his wife's considerable property, were in an embarrassed condition. Half Moscow and Petersburg were friends and relations of Stepan Arkadyevitch. He was born in the midst of those who had been and are the powerful ones of this world. 1/3 of the men in the government, the older men, had been friends of his father's, and had known him in petticoats. Another third were his intimate chums, and the remainder were friendly acquaintances. Consequently, the distributors of earthly blessings in the shapes of places, rents, shares, and such were all his friends, and could not overlook one of their own set, and Oblonsky had no need to make any special exertion to get a lucrative post. He had only not to refuse things, not to show jealousy, not to be quarrelsome or take offence, all of which, from his characteristic good nature, he never did. It would have struck him as absurd if he had been told that he would not get a position with the salary he required, especially as he expected nothing out of the way. He only wanted what the men of his own age and standing did get, and he was no worse qualified for performing duties of the kind than any other man. Stepan Arkadyevitch was not merely liked by all who knew him for his good humor, but for his bright disposition and his unquestionable honesty. In him, in his handsome, radiant figure, his sparkling eyes, black hair and eyebrows, and the white and red of his face, there was something which produced a physical effect of kindliness and good humor on the people who met him. "Ah, Stiva Oblonsky, here he is!" was almost always said with a smile of delight on meeting him, even though it happened at times that after a conversation with him it seemed that nothing particularly delightful had happened. The next day and the next everyone was just as delighted at meeting him again. After filling for 3 years the post of president of one of the government boards at Moscow, Stepan Arkadyevitch had won the respect, as well as the liking of his fellow officials, subordinates and superiors, and all who had had business with him. The principal qualities in Stepan Arkadyevitch which had gained him this universal respect in the service consisted, in the first place, of his extreme indulgence for others, founded on a consciousness of his own shortcomings; second, of his perfect liberalism, not the liberalism he read of in the papers, but the liberalism that was in his blood, in virtue of which he treated all men perfectly equally and exactly the same, whatever their fortune or calling might be; and thirdly, the most important point, his complete indifference to the business in which he was engaged, in consequence of which he was never carried away, and never made mistakes. On reaching the offices of the board, Stepan Arkadyevitch, escorted by a deferential porter with a portfolio, went into his little private room, put on his uniform, and went into the boardroom. The clerks and copyists all rose, greeting him with good-humored deference. Stepan Arkadyevitch moved quickly, as ever, to his place, shook hands with his colleagues, and sat down. He made a joke or two, and talked just as much as was consistent with due decorum, and began work. No one knew better than Stepan Arkadyevitch how to hit on the exact line between freedom, simplicity, and official stiffness necessary for the agreeable conduct of business. A secretary, with the good-humored deference common to everyone in Stepan Arkadyevitch's office, came up with papers, and began to speak in the familiar and easy tone which had been introduced by Stepan Arkadyevitch. "We've succeeded in getting the information from the government department of Pensa. Here, would you care?" "You've got them at last," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, laying his finger on the paper. "Now, gentlemen." And the sitting of the board began. If they knew, he thought, bending his head with a significant air as he listened to the report, what a guilty little boy their president was half an hour ago. And his eyes were laughing during the reading of the report. Till 2 o'clock the sitting would go on without a break, and at 2 o'clock there would be an interval and luncheon. It was not yet 2 when the large glass doors of the boardroom suddenly opened, and someone came in. All the officials sitting on the further side under the portrait of the Tsar and the eagle, delighted at any distraction, looked round at the door, but the doorkeeper standing at the door at once drove out the intruder, and closed the glass door behind him. When the case had been read through, Stepan Arkadyevitch got up and stretched, and by way of tribute to the liberalism of the times, took out a cigarette in the boardroom and went into his private room. 2 of the members of the board, the old veteran in the service, Nikitin, and the Kammerjunker Grinovitch, went in with him. "We shall have time to finish after lunch," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "To be sure we shall," said Nikitin. "A pretty sharp fellow this Fomin must be," said Grinovitch of one of the persons taking place in the case they were examining. Stepan Arkadyevitch frowned at Grinovitch's words, giving him thereby to understand that it was improper to pass judgment prematurely, and made no reply. "Who was that came in?" he asked the doorkeeper. "Some one, your Excellency, crept in without permission directly my back was turned. He was asking for you. I told him, when the members come out, then—" "Where is he?" "Maybe he's gone into the passage, but here he comes anyway. That's he," said the doorkeeper, pointing to a strongly built, broad-shouldered man with a curly beard, who, without taking off his sheepskin cap, was running lightly and rapidly up the worn steps of the stone staircase. One of the members, going down, a lean official with a portfolio, stood out of his way and looked disapprovingly at the legs of the stranger, then glanced inquiringly at Oblonsky. Stepan Arkadyevitch was standing at the top of the stairs. His good-naturedly beaming face above the embroidered collar of his uniform beamed more than ever when he recognized the man coming up. "Why, it's actually you, Levin, at last," he said with a friendly, mocking smile, scanning Levin as he approached. "How is it you have deigned to look me up in this den?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, and not content with shaking hands, he kissed his friend. "Have you been here long?" "I have just come and very much wanted to see you," said Levin, looking shyly and at the same time angrily and uneasily around. "Well, let's go into my room," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, who knew his friend's sensitive and irritable shyness, and taking his arm he drew him along, as though guiding him through dangers. Stepan Arkadyevitch was on familiar terms with almost all his acquaintances, and called almost all of them by their Christian names: old men of 60, boys of 20, actors, ministers, merchants, and adjutant generals, so that many of his intimate chums were to be found at the extreme ends of the social ladder, and would have been very much surprised to learn that they had, through the medium of Oblonsky, something in common. He was the familiar friend of everyone with whom he took a glass of champagne, and he took a glass of champagne with everyone, and when in consequence he met any of his disreputable chums, as he used in joke to call many of his friends, in the presence of his subordinates, he well knew how, with his characteristic tact, to diminish the disagreeable impression made on them. Levin was not a disreputable chum, but Oblonsky, with his ready tact, felt that Levin fancied he might not care to show his intimacy with him before his subordinates, and so he made haste to take him off into his room. Levin was almost of the same age as Oblonsky. Their intimacy did not rest merely on champagne. Levin had been the friend and companion of his early youth. They were fond of one another in spite of the difference in their characters and tastes, as friends are fond of one another who have been together in early youth. But in spite of this, each of them, as is often the way with men who have selected careers of different kinds, though in discussion he would even justify the other's career, in his heart despised it. It seemed to each of them that the life he led himself was the only real life, and the life led by his friend was a mere phantasm. Oblonsky could not restrain a slight mocking smile at the sight of Levin. How often he had seen him come up to Moscow from the country where he was doing something, what precisely Stepan Arkadyevitch could never quite make out, and indeed he took no interest in the matter. Levin arrived in Moscow always excited and in a hurry, rather ill at ease and irritated by his own want of ease, and for the most part with a perfectly new, unexpected view of things. Stepan Arkadyevitch laughed at this, and liked it. In the same way Levin in his heart despised the town mode of life of his friend, and his official duties, which he laughed at and regarded as trifling. But the difference was that Oblonsky, as he was doing the same as everyone did, laughed complacently and good-humoredly, while Levin laughed without complacency, and sometimes angrily. "We've long been expecting you," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, going into his room and letting Levin's hand go as though to show that here all danger was over. "I am very, very glad to see you," he said. "Well, how are you? Eh? When did you come?" Levin was silent, looking at the unknown faces of Oblonsky's two companions, and especially at the hand of the elegant Grinovitch, who had such long white fingers, such long yellow filbert-shaped nails, and such huge shining studs on the shirt cuff, that apparently they absorbed all his attention, and allowed him no freedom of thought. Oblonsky noticed this at once, and smiled. "Ah, to be sure, let me introduce you," he said. "My colleagues, Philip Ivanitch Nikitin, Mikhail Stanislavitch Grinovitch," and turning to Levin, "a district councillor, a modern district councilman, a gymnast who lifts 13 stone with one hand, a cattle breeder and sportsman, and my friend, Konstantin Dmitrievitch Levin, the brother of Sergey Ivanovitch Koznishev." "Delighted," said the veteran. "I have the honor of knowing your brother, Sergey Ivanovitch," said Grinovitch, holding out his slender hand with its long nails. Levin frowned, shook hands coldly, and at once turned to Oblonsky. Though he had great respect for his half-brother, an author well known to all Russia, he could not endure it when people treated him not as Konstantin Levin, but as the brother of the celebrated Koznishev. "No, I am no longer a district councillor. I've quarreled with them all and don't go to meetings any more," he said, turning to Oblonsky. "You've been quick about it," said Oblonsky with a smile. "But how? Why?" "It's a long story. I'll tell you sometime," said Levin, but he began telling him at once. "Well, to put it shortly, I was convinced that nothing was really done by the district councils, or ever could be," he began, as though someone had just insulted him. "On one side it's a plaything. They play at being a parliament, and I'm neither young enough nor old enough to find amusement in playthings. And on the other side," he stammered, "it's a means for the coterie of the district to make money. Formerly they had wardships, courts of justice. Now they have the district council. Not in the form of bribes, but in the form of unearned salary," he said, as hotly as though someone of those present had opposed his opinion. "Aha! You're in a new phase again, I see. A conservative," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "However, we can go into that later." "Yes, later. But I wanted to see you," said Levin, looking with hatred at Grinovitch's hand. Stepan Arkadyevitch gave a scarcely perceptible smile. "How was it you used to say you would never wear European dress again?" he said, scanning his new suit, obviously cut by a French tailor. "Ah, I see. A new phase." Levin suddenly blushed, not as grown men blush, slightly, without being themselves aware of it, but as boys blush, feeling that they are ridiculous through their shyness, and consequently ashamed of it, and blushing still more, almost to the point of tears. And it was so strange to see this sensible, manly face in such a childish plight that Oblonsky left off looking at him. "Oh, where shall we meet? You know I very much want to talk to you," said Levin. Oblonsky seemed to ponder. "I'll tell you what. Let's go to Gurin's for lunch, and then we can talk. I'm free till 3. "No," answered Levin, after an instant's thought. "I've got to go on somewhere else." "All right, then let's dine together." "Dine together? But I've nothing very particular, only a few words to say, and a question I want to ask you, and we can have a talk afterward." "Well, say the few words then at once, and we'll gossip after dinner." "Well, it's this," said Levin. "But it's of no importance, though." His face all at once took an expression of anger from the effort he was making to surmount his shyness. "What are the Shtcherbatskys doing?" "Everything as it used to be," he said. Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had long known that Levin was in love with his sister-in-law Kitty, gave a hardly perceptible smile, and his eyes sparkled merrily. "You said a few words, but I can't answer in a few words, because... Excuse me a minute." A secretary came in with respectful familiarity and the modest consciousness, characteristic of every secretary, of superiority to his chief in the knowledge of their business. He went up to Oblonsky with some papers, and began, under pretense of asking a question, to explain some objection. Stepan Arkadyevitch, without hearing him out, laid his hand genially on the secretary's sleeve. "No, you do as I told you," he said, softening his words with a smile, and with a brief explanation of his view of the matter, he turned away from the papers and said, "So do it that way, if you please, Zahar Nikititch." The secretary retired in confusion. During the consultation with the secretary, Levin had completely recovered from his embarrassment. He was standing with his elbows on the back of a chair, and on his face was a look of ironical attention. "I don't understand it, I don't understand it," he said. "What don't you understand?" said Oblonsky, smiling as brightly as ever, and picking up a cigarette. He expected some queer outburst from Levin. "I don't understand what you're doing," said Levin, shrugging his shoulders. "How can you do it seriously?" "Why not?" "Why, because there's nothing in it." "You think so, but we're overwhelmed with work." "On paper. But there, you've a gift for it," added Levin. "That's to say, you think there's a lack of something in me." "Perhaps so," said Levin. "But all the same, I admire your grandeur, and I'm proud that I've a friend in such a great person. You've not answered my question, though," he went on, with a desperate effort, looking Oblonsky straight in the face. "Oh, that's all very well. You wait a bit and you'll come to this yourself. It's very nice for you to have over 6,000 acres in the Karenina district, and such muscles and the freshness of a girl of 12. Still, you'll be one of us one day. Yes, as to your question, there's no change, but it's a pity you've been away so long." "Oh, why so?" Levin queried, panic-stricken. "Oh, nothing," responded Oblonsky. "We'll talk it over. But what's brought you up to town?" "Oh, we'll talk about that too later on," said Levin, reddening again up to his ears. "All right, I see," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "I should ask you to come to us, you know, but my wife's not quite the thing. But I'll tell you what, if you want to see them, they're sure to be at the Zoological Gardens from 4 to 5. Kitty skates. You drive along there, and I'll come and fetch you, and we'll go and dine somewhere together." "Capital. So, good-bye till then." "Now, mind, you'll forget, I know you, or rush off home to the country," Stepan Arkadyevitch called out, laughing. "No, truly." And Levin went out of the room, only when he was in the doorway remembering that he had forgotten to take leave of Oblonsky's colleagues. "That gentleman must be a man of great energy," said Grinevitch, when Levin had gone away. "Yes, my dear boy," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, nodding his head. "He's a lucky fellow. Over 6,000 acres in the Karenina district. Everything before him, and what youth and vigor! Not like some of us." "You have a great deal to complain of, haven't you, Stepan Arkadyevitch?" "Ah, yes, I'm in a poor way, a bad way," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, with a heavy sigh. End of Part 1, Chapter 5. Anna Karenina, Book 1, Chapter 6, read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. When Oblonsky asked Levin what had brought him to town, Levin blushed, and was furious with himself for blushing, because he could not answer, "I have come to make your sister-in-law an offer," though that was precisely what he had come for. The families of the Levins and the Shtcherbatskys were old, noble Moscow families, and had always been on intimate and friendly terms. This intimacy had grown still closer during Levin's student days. He had both prepared for the university with the young Prince Shtcherbatsky, the brother of Kitty and Dolly, and had entered at the same time with him. In those days Levin used often to be in the Shtcherbatskys' house, and he was in love with the Shtcherbatsky household. Strange as it may appear, it was with the household, the family, that Konstantin Levin was in love, especially with the feminine half of the household. Levin did not remember his own mother, and his only sister was older than he was, so it was that in the Shtcherbatskys' house he saw for the first time that inner life of an old, noble, cultivated, and honorable family, of which he had been deprived by the death of his father and mother. All the members of that family, especially the feminine half, were pictured by him as it were wrapped about with a mysterious poetical veil, and he not only perceived no defects whatever in them, but under the poetical veil that shrouded them, he assumed the existence of the loftiest sentiments and every possible perfection. Why, it was the three young ladies that had one day to speak French, and the next English. Why, it was that at certain hours they played by turns on the piano, the sounds of which were audible in their brother's room above, where the students used to work. Why, they were visited by those professors of French literature, of music, of drawing, of dancing. Why, at certain hours all three young ladies, with Mademoiselle Lidon, drove in the coach to the Tversky Boulevard, dressed in their satin cloaks, Dolly in a long one, Natalia in a half-long one, and Kitty in one so short that her shapely legs in tightly drawn red stockings were visible to all beholders. Why, it was they had to walk about the Tversky Boulevard escorted by a footman with a gold cockade in his hat. All this and much more that was done in their mysterious world he did not understand, but he was sure that everything that was done there was very good, and he was in love precisely with the mystery of the proceedings. In his student days he had all but been in love with the eldest, Dolly, but she was soon married to Oblonsky. Then he began being in love with the second. He felt, as it were, that he had to be in love with one of the sisters, only he could not quite make out which. But Natalia, too, had hardly made her appearance in the world when she married the diplomat Lvov. Kitty was still a child when Levin left the university. Young Shtcherbatsky went into the navy, was drowned in the Baltic, and Levin's relations with the Shtcherbatskys, in spite of his friendship with Oblonsky, became less intimate. But when, early in the winter of this year, Levin came to Moscow, after a year in the country, and saw the Shtcherbatskys, he realized which of the sisters he was indeed destined to love. One would have thought that nothing could be simpler than for him, a man of good family, rather rich than poor, and 32 years old, to make the young Princess Shtcherbatskaya an offer of marriage. In all likelihood he would at once have been looked upon as a good match. But Levin was in love, and so it seemed to him that Kitty was so perfect in every respect, that she was a creature far above everything earthly, and that he was a creature so low and earthly that it could not even be conceived that other people and she herself could regard him as worthy of her. After spending 2 months in Moscow in a state of enchantment, seeing Kitty almost every day in society, into which he went so as to meet her, he abruptly decided that it could not be, and went back to the country. Levin's conviction that it could not be was founded on the idea that, in the eyes of her family, he was a disadvantageous and worthless match for the charming Kitty, and that Kitty herself could not love him. In her family's eyes he had no ordinary definite career and position in society, while his contemporaries by this time, when he was 32, were already, one a colonel and another a professor, another president of a bank and railways, or president of a board like Oblonsky, but he knew very well how he must appear to others, was a country gentleman, occupied in breeding cattle, shooting game, and building barns, in other words, a fellow of no ability, who had not turned out well, and who was doing just what, according to the ideas of the world, is done by people fit for nothing else. The mysterious, enchanting Kitty herself could not love such an ugly person as he conceived himself to be, and above all, such an ordinary, in no way striking person. Moreover, his attitude to Kitty in the past, the attitude of a grown-up person to a child, arising from his friendship with her brother, seemed to him yet another obstacle to love. An ugly, good-natured man, as he considered himself, might, he supposed, be liked as a friend, but to be loved with such a love as that with which he loved Kitty, one would need to be a handsome and, still more, a distinguished man. He had heard that women often did care for ugly and ordinary men, but he did not believe it, for he judged by himself, and he could not himself have loved any but beautiful, mysterious, and exceptional women. But after spending 2 months alone in the country, he was convinced that this was not one of those passions of which he had experience in his early youth, that this feeling gave him not an instant's rest, that he could not live without deciding the question, would she or would she not be his wife, and that his despair had arisen only from his imaginings, that he had no sort of proof that he would be rejected, and he had now come to Moscow with a firm determination to make an offer, and get married if he were accepted, or he could not conceive what would become of him if he were rejected. End of chapter 6. This recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 7 of Anna Karenina, read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. On arriving in Moscow by a morning train, Levin had put up at the house of his elder half-brother, Koznichev. After changing his clothes, he went down to his brother's study, intending to talk to him at once about the object of his visit, and to ask his advice. But his brother was not alone. With him there was a well-known professor of philosophy, who had come from Kharkov expressly to clear up a difference that had arisen between them on a very important philosophical question. The professor was carrying on a hot crusade against materialists. Sergei Koznichev had been following this crusade with interest, and after reading the professor's last article, he had written him a letter stating his objections. He accused the professor of making too great concessions to the materialists, and the professor had promptly appeared to argue the matter out. The point in discussion was the question then in vogue: is there a line to be drawn between psychological and physiological phenomena in man, and if so, where? Sergey Ivanovitch met his brother with the smile of chilly friendliness he always had for everyone, and introducing him to the professor, went on with the conversation. A little man in spectacles with a narrow forehead tore himself from the discussion for an instant to greet Levin, and then went on talking without paying any further attention to him. Levin sat down to wait till the professor should go, but he soon began to get interested in the subject under discussion. Levin had come across the magazine articles about which they were disputing, and had read them, interested in them as a development of the first principles of science, familiar to him as a natural science student at the university. But he had never connected these scientific deductions as to the origin of man as an animal, as to reflex action, biology, and sociology, with those questions as to the meaning of life and death to himself, which had of late been more and more often on his mind. As he listened to his brother's argument with the professor, he noticed that they connected these scientific questions with those spiritual problems, that at times they almost touched on the latter, but every time they were close upon what seemed to him the chief point, they promptly beat a hasty retreat and plunged again into a sea of subtle distinctions, reservations, quotations, allusions, and appeals to authority, and it was with difficulty that he understood what they were talking about. "I cannot admit it," said Sergey Ivanovitch, with his habitual clearness, precision of expression, and elegance of phrase. "I cannot in any case agree with Kais that my whole conception of the external world has been derived from perceptions. The most fundamental idea, the idea of existence, has not been received by me through sensation. Indeed, there is no special sense organ for the transmission of such an idea." "Yes, but they, Wirth and Knaust and Pripasov, would answer that your consciousness of existence is derived from the conjunction of all your sensations, that consciousness of existence is the result of your sensations. Wirth indeed says plainly that, assuming there are no sensations, it follows that there is no idea of existence." "I maintain the contrary," began Sergey Ivanovitch. But here it seemed to Levin that just as they were close upon the real point of the matter, they were again retreating, and he made up his mind to put a question to the professor. "According to that, if my senses are annihilated, if my body is dead, I can have no existence of any sort?" he queried. The professor, in annoyance and, as it were, mental suffering at the interruption, looked round at the strange inquirer, more like a bargeman than a philosopher, and turned his eyes upon Sergey Ivanovitch, as though to ask, "What is one to say to him?" But Sergey Ivanovitch, who had been talking with far less heat and one-sidedness than the professor, and who had sufficient breadth of mind to answer the professor, and at the same time comprehend the simple and natural point of view from which the question was put, smiled and said, "That question we have no right to answer as yet." "We have not the requisite data," chimed in the professor, and he went back to his argument. "No," he said, "I would point out the fact that if, as Pripasov directly asserts, perception is based on sensation, then we are bound to distinguish sharply between these two conceptions." Levin listened no more, and simply waited for the professor to go. End of chapter 7. This recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 8 of Anna Karenina, read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. When the professor had gone, Sergey Ivanovitch turned to his brother. "Delighted that you've come. For some time, is it? How's your farming getting on?" Levin knew that his elder brother took little interest in farming, and only put the question in deference to him, and so he only told him about the sale of his wheat and money matters. Levin had meant to tell his brother of his determination to get married, and to ask his advice. He had indeed firmly resolved to do so. But after seeing his brother, listening to his conversation with the professor, hearing afterwards the unconsciously patronizing tone in which his brother questioned him about agricultural matters (their mother's property had not been divided, and Levin took charge of both their shares), Levin felt that he could not, for some reason, begin to talk to him of his intention of marrying. He felt that his brother would not look at it as he would have wished him to. "Well, how's your district council doing?" asked Sergey Ivanovitch, who was greatly interested in these local boards and attached great importance to them. "I really don't know." "What? Why, surely you're a member of the board?" "No, I'm not a member now. I've resigned," answered Levin, "and I no longer attend the meetings." "What a pity," commented Sergey Ivanovitch, frowning. Levin, in self-defense, began to describe what took place in the meetings in his district. "That's how it always is," Sergey Ivanovitch interrupted him. "We Russians are always like that. Perhaps it's our strong point, really, the faculty of seeing our own shortcomings, but we overdo it. We comfort ourselves with irony when we always have on the tip of our tongues. All I say is, give such rights as our local self-government to any other European people. Why, the Germans or the English would have worked their way to freedom from them, while we simply turn them into ridicule." "But how can it be helped?" said Levin penitently. "It was my last effort, and I did try with all my soul. I can't. I'm no good at it." "It's not that you're no good at it," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "It's that you don't look at it as you should." "Perhaps not," Levin answered dejectedly. "Oh, do you know brother Nikolay's turned up again?" This brother Nikolay was the elder brother of Konstantin Levin and half-brother of Sergey Ivanovitch, a man utterly ruined, who had dissipated the greater part of his fortune, was living in the strangest and lowest company, and had quarrelled with his brothers. "What did you say?" Levin cried with horror. "How do you know?" "Prokofy saw him in the street." "Here in Moscow? Where is he? Do you know?" Levin got up from his chair as though on the point of starting off at once. "I'm sorry I told you," said Sergey Ivanovitch, shaking his head at his younger brother's excitement. "I sent to find out where he's living, and sent him his IOU to Trubin, which I paid. This is the answer he sent me." And Sergey Ivanovitch took a note from under a paperweight and handed it to his brother. Levin read in the queer, familiar handwriting: "I humbly beg you to leave me in peace. That's the only favor I ask of my gracious brothers. Nikolay Levin." Levin read it, and without raising his head stood with the note in his hands opposite Sergey Ivanovitch. There was a struggle in his heart between the desire to forget his unhappy brother for the time, and the consciousness that it would be base to do so. "He obviously wants to offend me," pursued Sergey Ivanovitch, "but he cannot offend me, and I should have wished with all my heart to assist him, but I know it's impossible to do that." "Yes, yes," repeated Levin. "I understand and appreciate your attitude to him, but I shall go and see him." "If you want to, do, but I shouldn't advise it," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "As regards myself, I have no fear of your doing so. He will not make you quarrel with me, but for your own sake I should say you would do better not to go. You can't do him any good. Still, do as you please." "Very likely I can't do any good, but I feel, especially at such a moment, but that's another thing, I feel I could not be at peace." "Well, that I don't understand," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "One thing I do understand," he added, "it's a lesson in humility. I have come to look very differently and more charitably on what is called infamous since brother Nikolay has become what he is. You know what he did." "Oh, it's awful, awful," repeated Levin. After obtaining his brother's address from Sergey Ivanovitch's footman, Levin was on the point of setting off at once to see him, but on second thought he decided he ought to put off his visit until the evening. The first thing to do, to set his heart at rest, was to accomplish what he had come to Moscow for. From his brothers, Levin went to Oblonsky's office, and on getting news of the Shtcherbatskys from him, he drove to the place where he had been told he might find Kitty. End of chapter 8. This recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 9 of Anna Karenina. Read for LibriVox.org by Kirsten Ferreri. At 4 o'clock, conscious of his throbbing heart, Levin stepped out of a hired sledge at the Zoological Gardens and turned along the path to the frozen mounds and the skating ground, knowing that he would certainly find her there, as he had seen the Shtcherbatskys' carriage at the entrance. It was a bright, frosty day. Rows of carriages, sledges, drivers, and policemen were standing in the approach. Crowds of well-dressed people, with hats bright in the sun, swarmed about the entrance, and along the well-swept little paths between the little houses adorned with carving in the Russian style. The old curly birches of the gardens, all their twigs laden with snow, looked as though freshly decked in sacred vestments. He walked along the path toward the skating ground and kept saying to himself, "You mustn't be excited, you must be calm. What's the matter with you? What do you want? Be quiet, stupid." He conjured his heart. And the more he tried to compose himself, the more breathless he found himself. An acquaintance met him and called him by his name, but Levin did not even recognize him. He went toward the mounds, whence came the clank of the chains of sledges as they slipped down or were dragged up, the rumble of the sliding sledges, and the sounds of merry voices. He walked on a few steps, and the skating ground lay open before his eyes, and at once, amidst all the skaters, he knew her. He knew she was there by the rapture and the terror that seized his heart. She was standing talking to a lady at the opposite end of the ground. There was apparently nothing striking either in her dress or in her attitude, But for Levin she was as easy to find in that crowd as a rose among nettles. Everything was made bright by her. She was the smile that shed light on all round her. "Is it possible that I can go over there on the ice, go up to her?" he thought. The place where she stood seemed to him a holy shrine, unapproachable, and there was one moment when he was almost retreating, so overwhelmed was he with terror. He had to make an effort to master himself, and to remind himself that people of all sorts were moving about her, and that he too might come there to skate. He walked down, for a long while avoiding looking at her as at the sun, but seeing her as one does the sun, without looking. On that day of the week, and at that time of day, people of one set, all acquainted with one another, used to meet on the ice. There were crack skaters there showing off their skill, and learners clinging to chairs with timid, awkward movements, boys and elderly people skating with hygienic motives. They seemed to Levin an elect band of blissful beings because they were here, near her. All the skaters, it seemed, with perfect self-possession, skated towards her, skated by her, even spoke to her, and were happy quite apart from her, enjoying the capital ice and the fine weather. Nikolai Shtcherbatsky, Kitty's cousin, in a short jacket and tight trousers, was sitting on a garden seat with his skates on. Seeing Levin, he shouted to him, "Ah, the first skater in Russia! Been here long? First-rate ice! Do put your skates on!" "I haven't got my skates," Levin answered, marveling at this boldness and ease in her presence, and not for 1 second losing sight of her, though he did not look at her. He felt as though the sun were coming near him. She was in a corner, and turning out her slender feet in their high boots with obvious timidity, she skated towards him. A boy in Russian dress, desperately waving his arms and bowed down to the ground, overtook her. She skated a little uncertainly. Taking her hands out of the little muff that hung on a cord, she held them ready for any emergency, and looking towards Levin, whom she had recognized, she smiled at him and at her own fears. When she had got round the turn, she gave herself a push off with one foot, and skated straight up to Shtcherbatsky. Clutching at his arm, she nodded, smiling, to Levin. She was more splendid than he had imagined her. When he thought of her, he could call up a vivid picture of her to himself, especially the charm of that little fair head, so freely set on the shapely girlish shoulders, and so full of childish brightness and good humor. The childishness of her expression, together with the delicate beauty of her figure, made up her special charm, and that he fully realized. But what always struck him in her as something unlooked for was the expression of her eyes, soft, serene, and truthful, and above all her smile, which always transported Levin to an enchanted world, where he felt himself softened and tender, as he remembered himself in some days of his early childhood. "Have you been here long?" she said, giving him her hand. "Thank you," she added, as he picked up the handkerchief that had fallen out of her muff. I've not long, today, I arrived," answered Levin, in his emotion not at once understanding the question. "I was meaning to come see you," he said, and then, recollecting with what intention he was trying to see her, he promptly was overcome with confusion and blushed. "I didn't know you could skate, and skate so well." She looked at him earnestly, as though wishing to make out the cause of his confusion. "Your praise is worth having. The tradition is kept up here that you are the best of skaters," she said, with her little black-gloved hand brushing a grain of hoarfrost off her muff. "Yes, I used to once skate with passion. I wanted to reach perfection." "You do everything with passion, I think," she said, smiling. "I should so like to see how you skate. Put on skates and let us skate together." Skate together? Can that be possible? Thought Levin, gazing at her. "I'll put them on directly," he said, and he went off to get skates. "It's a long while since we've seen you here, sir," said the attendant, supporting his foot and screwing on the heel of the skate. "Except you, there's none of the gentlemen first-rate skaters. Will that be all right?" said he, tightening the strap. "Oh, yes, yes, make haste, please," answered Levin, with difficulty restraining the smile of rapture which would overspread his face. Yes, he thought, this now is life, this is happiness. "Together," she said. "Let us skate together. Speak to her now? But that's just why I'm afraid to speak, because I'm happy now, happy in hope, anyway. And then? But I must, away with weakness." Levin rose to his feet, took off his overcoat, and scurrying over the rough ice round the hut, came out on the smooth ice, and skated without effort, as it were, by simple exercise of will, increasing and slackening speed, and turning his course. He approached with timidity, but again her smile reassured him. She gave him her hand, and they set off side by side, going faster and faster, and the more rapidly they moved, the more tightly she grasped his hand. "With you I should soon learn. I somehow feel confidence in you," she said to him. "And I have confidence myself when you are leaning on me," he said, but was at once panic-stricken at what he had said, and blushed. And indeed, no sooner had he uttered those words when all at once, like the sun going behind a cloud, her face lost all its friendliness, and Levin detected the familiar change in her expression that denoted the working of a thought. A crease showed on her smooth brow. "Is there anything troubling you? Though I've no right to ask such a question," he added hurriedly. "Oh, why so? No, I've nothing to trouble me," she responded coldly, and she added immediately, "You haven't seen Mademoiselle Linon, have you?" "Not yet." "Go and speak to her, she likes you so much." "What's wrong? I've offended her, Lord help me," thought Levin, and he flew off toward the old Frenchwoman with the grey ringlets, who was sitting on a bench. Smiling and showing her false teeth, she greeted him as an old friend. "Yes, you see we're growing up," she said, glancing toward Kitty, "and growing old. Tiny Bear has grown big now," pursued the Frenchwoman, laughing, and she reminded him of his joke about the three young ladies, whom he had compared to the three bears in the English nursery tale. "Do you remember that's what you used to call them?" He remembered absolutely nothing, but she had been laughing at the joke for 10 years now, and was fond of it. "Now go and skate, go and skate! Our Kitty has learned to skate nicely, hasn't she?" When Levin darted up to Kitty, her face was no longer stern. Her eyes looked at him with the same sincerity and friendliness, but Levin fancied that in her friendliness there was a certain note of deliberate composure, and he felt depressed. After talking a little of her old governess and her peculiarities, she questioned him about his life. "Surely you must be dull in the country in the winter, aren't you?" she said. "No, I'm not dull. I'm very busy," he said, feeling that she was holding him in check by her composed tone. She would not have the force to break through, just as it had been at the beginning of the winter. "Are you going to stay in town long?" Kitty questioned him. "I don't know," he answered, not thinking of what he was saying. The thought that if he were held in check by her tone of quiet friendliness, he would end by going back again without deciding anything came into his mind, and he resolved to make a struggle against it. "How is it you don't know?" "I don't know, it depends on you," he said, and was immediately horror-stricken at his own words. Whether it was that she had heard his words or that she did not want to hear them, she made a sort of stumble, twice struck out, and hurriedly skated away from him. She skated up to Mademoiselle Linon, said something to her, and went toward the pavilion where the ladies took off their skates. "My God, what have I done? Merciful God, help me, guide me," said Levin, praying inwardly, and at the same time feeling a need of violent exercise